I have to ask you about this. During question time, the manager of opposition business, Paul Fletcher, had a shot at your wealth. I should tell our viewers that you're self-made wealth. You haven't inherited anything. You were a political advisor for Kevin Rudd, started your own business and sold it. But he asked a very cheeky hypothetical about a typical Australian called Andrew, I guess you're a typical Australian, who recently had to relocate from Bellevue Hill to Parramatta for work reasons going into Parliament and happens, these are my words, not his, and happens to own 5 houses, he said, including a newly acquired $12 million, should I say, beach house at Palm Beach. Will he be eligible to receive the rebate on all 5 houses? Is the question. Will you be eligible for that rebate on all 5 houses?
Well, Andrew, I've got to say, I never thought I would see the day where the Liberal Party of Australia was attacking people for their business success. It just shows how confused they are. You know, I'm not offended by this. I'm proud of the business success that me and my team had. As you said, we started that business from scratch. We started it in my attic. We built it to more than 70 people. And, you know, Paul Fletcher, who asked that question, my understanding is he hasn't had much of a business career in his life. He's always been employed in government or in government relations. You know, he doesn't understand how hard it is to make payroll. He doesn't understand how hard it is for a small business to grow. And so for me, that business experience that I've had helps me in precisely this question. It makes me realise that you can't just dream up a new way of delivering payments to people that won't be accepted by the business and isn't consistent with those business processes. The industry has told us that it would be nearly impossible to means test this measure in the way that Paul Fletcher wants us to. And so that's why we've made it a measure that is available to every household.
Fair enough. But let me just go back to this point. Are you eligible on all 5 houses for the rebate?
Well, what the Treasurer has said is that for each house, where that house is tenanted and the tenant is paying the energy bill, the tenant is eligible for that rebate. Sure. Where a house is owned by an individual, that individual is eligible for the rebate. All
right. Well, the government had a win in the Senate last week, as I just said, the PRRT changes and also what the opposition calls a ute tax, the fuel efficiency standards. Do you feel this is a big win for the government?
I think it's a good win for the government. I think these are 2 very good policies for us. I think the PRRT one is a really interesting example right now. You know, right now in the Parliament, we have the opposition, the Liberals, suggesting that the government's Future Made in Australia policy is money for billionaires. This is a policy to help build the industries for Australia's future, to create jobs for the next generation. But they are opposing a tax increase on the big gas companies, even though the big companies have accepted that tax increase. So it's a really confused position from the Liberals. But overall, I think this is a good win for the government and a good example of good policy coming through.
Well, let me ask about Peter Dutton's budget reply speech. It seems to me a cut to permanent migration and a cut to net migration, I just outlined, down to 160,000 a year, pretty much pre-COVID levels, would be pretty well received given the housing and rent crisis we have at the moment. Do you agree?
Well, I think many Australians think that immigration is too high. They understand that that's partly a consequence of the bounce back from COVID. And that's why the government has put in place a plan to halve migration levels by next year from last year. But what I'd say is, though, we have to manage this very carefully to make sure that we don't damage really important Australian industries like the international education industry. The international education industry is a $40 billion industry in Australia, second only to the mining industry in terms of what it brings into this country. So as we manage migration levels appropriately, we have to make sure that we do it carefully so we don't destroy great Australian industries that bring a lot to this country.
What do you make of the opposition super for a first home owner deposit policy?
Look, honestly, this is one of those policies which looks good on the surface, but when you think about it for just a minute, you realise this is terrible policy that will hurt the people it is aimed to help. Think about this scenario, Andrew. You've got an auction in Sydney or Melbourne or Perth. 2 young couples turn up to the auction hoping to buy their first home. Both of them, under the Liberal policy, have withdrawn up to $50,000 of their superannuation. What's the consequence of that? Who's the winner out of that auction? Well, I'll tell you, it's neither of the new home buyers. The only person who wins in that scenario is the vendor. because those couples who turn up to that auction to buy their first home will end up bidding against each other. The price will go up, they'll have to pay more debt, and guess what? They will have also trashed their retirement savings on the way through. So this is not a panacea for first home buyers. This is a nightmare for first home buyers, and the Liberals should withdraw this policy because it is a really bad piece of policy.
All right. Well, what is the answer though? Because surely in your electorate, you're hearing from people who are suffering from higher rents while they're trying to buy a home, and because of what's happened in the last 5 years, can't get in the market. Is there an answer, or are things in places, prices in places like Sydney, like a runaway train? It's too late for young people.
Well, it's true that we're in a full-blown housing crisis. In my electorate of Parramatta, house prices have gone up by 12% over the last 12 months. Rents have gone up even more, 23% over the last 12 months. And that's why the government has announced $32 billion in new housing initiatives since we came to government. $32 billion to increase supply and get more people into homes. Now compare that with the opposition leader who had his big chance in his budget reply, and he did not announce a single new dollar for housing supply. And that's a pretty extraordinary position for the Liberal Party to take at a time when everybody says that the problem is housing supply.
Yeah, okay, so you just called it a full-blown housing crisis. Do you accept that the immigration that's occurred has contributed to that?
Absolutely. There's no question that high levels of immigration put pressure on housing prices.
But the government's allowed that.
No, that is a consequence of the bounce back through COVID, and that's why the government has a plan to reduce immigration levels by a half between last year and next year.
All right, supply's really a state government responsibility, but has it got to the point where the federal government has to make a big contribution with supply because the situation's that bad?
Absolutely it has. Absolutely it has. And that's why you've seen the Albanese Labor government working with our partners in the states, delivering some of the biggest housing policies this country has ever seen, $32 billion of new measures to get supply moving, to build more houses, to put downward pressure on house prices and get more people into homes.
All right, Peter Dutton, you just mentioned this, he's described the Future Made in Australia legislation as giving billions to billionaires. Do Twiggy Forrest and Gina Rinehart and these sort of people need this money for their companies to progress these projects? Can you explain why this is necessary, these tax credits, etc.?
I think this is necessary because budgets, Andrew, budgets have to be about more than dividing up the wealth today. They have to be about creating the wealth for the future. And Australia needs to be thinking about what are our industries of the future? What are the jobs that the next generation are going to get? And for example, the world is in the middle of a massive battery boom, and Australia has half of the world's lithium. Surely we back ourselves to get our share of that boom? Australia has some of the world's biggest solar resources and lots of neighbours in Asia who import energy. Surely we back ourselves to create an export industry, and that's what Future Made in Australia is all about.
And that's fair enough, but can you see how it would grate with voters to see, these billionaires get the money? That's what Peter Dutton's playing on there. So why is it necessary for them to be propped up if these are industries which are going to work going forward?
Because we've been talking about these industries for decades. We've been talking about critical minerals, we've been talking about green hydrogen, and you know what? We haven't catalysed those industries to grow and create the jobs of the future. In fact, Australia has gone backwards on Harvard's Index of Economic Complexity. We now sit at 93 out of 133 nations. And finally, we have a government who's going to back Australia to be successful in those industries of the future that we've been talking about for decades, but never gotten off the ground in a substantial way.
So Peter Dutton is keen to push ahead with nuclear energy. He said in his budget reply, young people support its introduction, and so does the majority of the world's developed countries. So what's your view on that?
Well, if people are so supportive of nuclear energy, why didn't he have the guts to outline that policy in detail in his budget reply? He said he was going to do it. We were all sitting there waiting with bated breath, and he had no information on costs and no information on locations. I think the people who don't like nuclear energy are actually sitting in Peter Dutton's party room holding him back on this policy.
Just finally, I'll mention the issue of Fatima Payman. She got herself into trouble, I guess you could call it, during the week because of the saying from the river to the sea. And we saw some division at that Victorian Labor conference and those protests. One of your friends in the parliament is Josh Burns, a Jewish MP, and there's a large Middle Eastern community in your electorate. So what's your take on how the government has handled this issue generally and the Fatima Payman situation?
Look, I think the government has been incredibly clear and consistent on this issue from day one. From day one, we've been calling for international law to be upheld. From day one, we've been calling for civilians to be protected. From day one, we've been calling for humanitarian aid to help those in need. At each stage of this conflict, Australia has been clear and principled and consistent, and that's why I'm proud of the policy that Labor's put forward.
And Fatima Payman, do you have some sympathy for her situation, or did she go too far? What's your view? I know, it's not really your role. You're not the leader of the party to say, but what was your personal reaction to all that?
Look, my personal reaction is that Fatima Payman is a terrific colleague, and she is, as you said, under a lot of pressure. I have enormous confidence in Fatima Payman. I think she's a terrific MP, and I absolutely acknowledge her perspective on this issue, but it's not the same as mine.
Andrew Charlton, thanks so much for your time this morning.
Thanks, Andrew.